July is the month that decides whether your tomato plants make it to a real harvest or just sit there looking green and doing nothing. The plants are usually tall by now, flowers are opening, and the first fruit is starting to form. But this is also when heat stress, disease, and simple neglect wreck more tomato crops than any other point in the season. The good news is that none of the fixes are complicated. 7 adjustments made this month, done consistently, are usually the difference between a handful of tomatoes and buckets of them by late summer. Here's what actually needs to happen. If you're growing tomatoes this summer or planning to next year, it helps to have these kinds of checklists on hand right when the season calls for them, so subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one when a new stage of the growing season comes around. 1. Water deep, not often. Tomato roots follow the water, so if you're giving them a light sprinkle every day, the roots stay shallow and the plant becomes fragile the moment a hot spell hits. What tomatoes actually want in July is a deep soak 2 or 3 times a week, rather than a daily splash. The goal is to get water down 6 to 8 inches into the soil, which pushes roots deeper and makes the whole plant more resistant to heat and drought. Inconsistent watering is also the direct cause of blossom end rot, that black, sunken patch that shows up on the bottom of the fruit. It's not a disease and it's not a calcium deficiency in most cases. It's the plant's inability to move calcium properly because the water supply keeps swinging between too dry and too wet. Watering in the early morning is better than watering at night, since wet foliage sitting overnight in warm weather is exactly the kind of environment fungal disease thrives in. A simple way to check whether it's time to water again is to push a finger 2 inches into the soil near the base of the plant, and if it's still moist at that depth, there's no need to add more yet. Container tomatoes dry out much faster than plants in the ground, sometimes needing water daily once temperatures climb into the 90s. Since the soil volume around the roots is so much smaller and heats up faster than open garden soil. A layer of mulch, which gets covered next, works together with this watering routine, so the two habits really need to be built at the same time, rather than treated as separate fixes. 2. Mulch the base heavily. By July, bare soil around a tomato plant is a liability. It heats up fast under direct sun, it loses moisture quickly, and it splashes soil-borne fungal spores onto the lower leaves every time it rains or gets watered. A 2 to 3 inch layer of straw, shredded leaves, or grass clippings around the base solves all 3 problems at once. It keeps the root zone several degrees cooler during heat waves, it holds moisture so the deep watering actually lasts, and it creates a physical barrier between the soil and the lowest leaves. Keep the mulch a couple of inches away from direct contact with the stem itself, since piling it right against the plant can trap moisture there and invite rot. Straw and shredded leaves are generally better choices than fresh grass clippings, because fresh clippings can mat down, heat up as they decompose, and sometimes carry herbicide residue if the lawn was treated earlier in the season. Black plastic mulch is another option used by some growers specifically because it raises soil temperature, which can help in cooler climates, but in a typical July heat wave organic mulch that cools the soil is usually the better choice. Topping up the mulch layer partway through the month is worth doing too, since straw and leaves break down and thin out over a few weeks of watering and sun exposure. 3. Prune for airflow. Tomato plants in full summer growth get dense fast, and a crowded plant is a plant with poor air circulation, which means fungal disease spreads faster once it starts. This is the month to remove the lower leaves, especially anything touching or close to the soil, since those are the first ones to pick up splashed spores, and the first ones that don't get much sunlight anyway. It also helps to remove some of the suckers, the small shoots that grow in the joint between the main stem and a branch, particularly on indeterminate varieties that keep growing taller through the season. Pruning too aggressively can reduce yield, so the target isn't to strip the plant down but to open it up enough that light and air can move through the canopy. Determinate varieties, the ones bred to stay compact and stop growing once they set a certain number of fruit clusters, generally shouldn't be pruned heavily at all, since removing too much foliage on these types can cut into the harvest rather than help it. Indeterminate varieties, which keep growing and producing until frost, tolerate and actually benefit from more regular pruning throughout July, since they'll keep generating new suckers all season if left alone. Any pruning cuts are best made with clean, sharp scissors or shears rather than pulled off by hand, since a torn wound heals slower and gives disease an easier entry point than a clean cut does. Whatever fertilizer got the plant to this size isn't necessarily what it needs now. Early in the season, tomatoes benefit from nitrogen because it drives leaf and stem growth, but by July the plant is setting fruit, and too much nitrogen at this stage pushes it to keep growing leaves instead of ripening tomatoes. This is the point to switch to a fertilizer higher in phosphorus and potassium, sometimes labeled as a bloom or fruiting formula, which supports flower development and fruit production instead of foliage. Overdoing nitrogen in July is one of the most common reasons a tomato plant looks lush and healthy all summer, but produces disappointingly little fruit. A fertilizer ratio where the last two numbers are noticeably higher than the first, something like a 5-10-10 or a 4-18-38 formulated for tomatoes, is generally the target for this stage of the season. Feeding every 2 to 3 weeks is usually enough once the plant is actively fruiting, since more frequent feeding than that risks pushing growth too hard and doesn't give the plant time to actually use what's already in the soil. Adding a calcium source like crushed eggshells worked into the soil or a foliar calcium spray can also help prevent blossom end rot in gardens where the soil is naturally low in calcium, though for most home gardens the watering consistency covered earlier matters more than the calcium supply itself. 5. Watch for pests and disease early. July heat brings out tomato hornworms, aphids, spider mites, and the fungal diseases that thrive in warm, humid conditions like early blight and septoria leaf spot. Hornworms are large green caterpillars that can strip a plant of leaves within days, and they're easiest to catch by checking the undersides of leaves in the early morning or evening when they're most active. Early blight and septoria both start as small dark spots on the lower, older leaves before working upward, so catching them at that stage and removing the affected leaves can slow the spread significantly. Aphids and spider mites tend to cluster on new growth and the undersides of leaves, and a strong spray of water or an insecticidal soap usually handles a small infestation before it becomes a large one. Checking the plant every few days, rather than waiting until something looks obviously wrong, is what actually keeps these problems small. Hornworms can also be identified by the dark green or black droppings they leave on leaves below where they're feeding, which is often easier to spot than the caterpillar itself since its coloring blends in so well with the plant. For fungal issues like early blight, a copper-based fungicide or a baking soda and water spray applied to the foliage can slow the spread once it's caught early, though removing and disposing of infected leaves, rather than composting them, is the more important step, since the fungal spores can survive in compost and reinfect plants the following year. Spacing plants far enough apart when they're first planted also reduces disease pressure in July, since crowded plants trap humidity between them even after individual pruning, so if plants were set too close together this season, that's a detail worth adjusting before next year's planting. 6. Support the plant through the heat. Heavy fruit combined with intense July sun puts real physical stress on tomato plants. Branches loaded with fruit need solid staking or caging, because a branch that snaps under weight doesn't just lose that fruit, it opens a wound that disease can enter through. In regions where temperatures regularly climb past 90 degrees, some afternoon shade, even something as simple as a shade cloth propped over the plants during the hottest hours, can prevent blossom drop, which happens when extreme heat causes flowers to fall off before they're pollinated. Tomatoes generally stop setting fruit reliably once daytime temperatures stay above the mid-90s, so managing heat exposure during a heat wave protects the next round of fruit even if the current one is already secure. Cages and stakes should be checked and reinforced partway through July too, since a plant that was adequately supported in May or June can easily outgrow that support by midsummer once it's carrying a full load of fruit. Sun scald is another heat-related issue worth watching for, where fruit exposed directly to intense afternoon sun develops a pale, leathery patch on the side facing the light, and this is one more reason not to prune away so much foliage that the fruit itself loses its natural shade cover. Watering deeply the evening before an expected heat spike, rather than during the hottest part of the day, also helps the plant handle the stress better, since the moisture reserve is already in place before the heat arrives. 7. Harvest at the right time and keep the plant producing. Tomatoes don't need to fully ripen on the vine to taste good, and in fact picking them once they start to show color and finishing the ripening process indoors can protect the fruit from cracking, sun scald, and pests. A tomato that's left on the vine too long in July heat is more likely to split from sudden watering after a dry spell, or get damaged by birds and insects before it's picked. Harvesting regularly also signals the plant to keep producing, since a tomato plant that's carrying a lot of ripe or overripe fruit will naturally slow down new fruit development. Removing spent flowers and any fruit that's cracked or rotting keeps the plant's energy directed toward the next wave of tomatoes instead of maintaining fruit that's already lost. The right time to pick is usually when the fruit reaches full color for its variety and gives slightly to gentle pressure, since waiting for it to soften fully on the vine increases the odds it gets damaged before it's collected. Twisting the fruit gently while supporting the stem, rather than pulling straight down, reduces the chance of snapping the branch it's attached to, which matters more in July when branches are already carrying extra weight. Tomatoes picked slightly early and ripened on a countertop out of direct sunlight will still develop full flavor over a few days, and this approach is particularly useful right before a stretch of heavy rain, since fruit left on the vine during a downpour after a dry spell is the most common cause of splitting. None of these 7 steps require special equipment or a lot of time, but skipping them in July is what turns a promising tomato plant into a disappointing one by August. Consistent watering, a solid layer of mulch, some pruning for airflow, the right fertilizer for this stage of growth, close attention to pests and disease, support through the heat, and steady harvesting all work together, and missing even one of them tends to show up in the yield a few weeks later. Most of this is maintenance rather than anything technical, and a lot of gardeners already know these steps individually, but fall behind on 1 or 2 once the season gets busy, which is usually enough to knock a plant off track for the rest of the summer. Setting a fixed day each week to walk through the whole list, checking soil moisture, mulch depth, new growth that needs pruning, leaf color for signs of nutrient stress, and the undersides of leaves for pests, turns this from a set of separate chores into a single 10-minute routine per plant. Tomato plants that get this kind of consistent attention through July typically keep producing steadily into September, while plants that only get attention when something visibly goes wrong tend to lose weeks of productive growth waiting to recover. If this covered something you're currently dealing with in your own garden, subscribe for the rest of this season's growing guides, since August and September bring their own set of adjustments as the weather starts to shift.